subsequent slides. This council has tended to merge the two, so we've got one policy to cover both sets of legislative requirements. The intention of the legislation is, as I said, to create that, or rather the purpose, it's trying to create an environment where gambling activities in New Zealand are permitted. It's clear that this is legal, but there is also a key focus on managing and minimising the harm that's associated with it. So in that sense, it's about balance, as we'll see later in the workshop, create some interesting discussions when it comes to the application of policy levers. New Zealand's one of the few countries in the world where Class 4 gambling activities are required to be not-for-profit and for charitable activities, amongst other authorised purposes. And that has created, some people have commented, sort of an insidious model being redistributed to other community groups that are predominantly of a higher socioeconomic status. There is, you can also think about it, I suppose, in the sense of money in and money out. So there's a breakdown that this is a couple of years old, but it states basically for every dollar that goes into a pokie machine, around 91.5 cents is returned to the player in the form of winnings, and that's what it claims. And then the remainder, the 9 odd cents, 20% goes, about 33% rather goes to the government in the forms of duties and GST. There's an amount that goes to a problem gambling levy that funds problem gambling services that we'll discuss later on. There are certain costs that go to the DIA, but ultimately around 40% of that remainder gets returned to the community.
Those figures come from, that's very surprising. The 91% back to the...
Yeah.
That's very surprising.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But at what cost? As part of our 2022 review, it was from a trust, but the numbers weren't disputed by other submitters, and I haven't been able to find anything else that's more up to date. The key contention from those that disagree with the practice, for example, Problem Gambling Foundation, is where the harm falls and where the return to community falls.
Well, this is where it's surprising, because I would always suggest that if you're going to get 91 cents back at every dollar you put in, there's no harm. I mean, seriously. That's why I'm thinking it'd be interesting to see where those figures actually did come from and if in fact they are correct.
And I think we also need to remember that that's, if the numbers are correct, and like I say, it's what I was able to find, so on it, but if those numbers are indeed correct, then that would be on average number. amount and you get disproportionate winnings, that will obviously skew the stats to someone who spends quite a lot but doesn't get winnings. So that's not talking about the average after someone has won, is how I'd interpret that. This is live. There we go. Yeah. Hence, we should be using our microphones, I suppose. Anyway. Right. No worries at all. So the next couple of slides simply illustrate the purposes and the requirements of each of those two acts. I don't intend to go through those in any extensive detail. I just want you to be aware and you can see that there are various requirements, and again, it is about as set in the Act. That's not something that Council's setting, that's what's set in the Act, and then Council's application of a policy to try and, at its discretion, manage harm within that. It is important to note that councils are required to have these policies, and the purpose for that is to enable community input into the decision making so that there can be a particular Timaru district flavour is that we are required by law to undertake these reviews every 3 years. We are behind and overdue. That would be the case last year when we still had a few months to go. We did proactively contact the DIA and tell them, so we have been working with them on that. And also note that we have about a dozen or so years ago, and other councils do fall behind from time to time. So I don't think the DIA is coming down on us like a ton of bricks, but it is something that we do need to do. Moving on to the second was adopted right at the end of 2022. So the entire policy itself can be found on our website, but I suppose Class 4 gambling and the TAB venues as equivalent, so what applies for one applies to the other. Some councils do separate them. For example, Ashburton District, they just reviewed and readopted their policy, and they've decided that no TAB venues should be permitted in their district. They currently have none anyway. In terms of the number of machines, so it's slightly complicated in the legislation. There are different numbers permitted depending on when the licence was provided, but in general, new venues, if you wanted to set up a new venue tomorrow, you would, according to the law, district, we've said that the limit is 7, so we've got a cap there that's lower than the permitted amount in legislation. In terms of location of venues, we allow them within certain zones, and then we also overlay that with a distance requirement related to sensitive sites. Now, sensitive sites is defined in the legislation. Here is that some school, place of worship or community facility. So if a licence was to be sought, then Paul and his colleagues processing that would apply whether or not there is a sensitive site. Shortly, there have been a decrease in the number of venues, a decrease in the number of machines overall, so it's not as if we're getting requests for these. In fact, I'm not quite sure when the last time we had a request for a venue was.
We had some interest when the COS New venues in town?
Just very briefly, because I'm conscious of time, I want to keep zipping along, so there's good time for discussion. We do allow potential exemptions and also relocations by consent of the previous Environmental Services Committee, so obviously we'd look to update that, but I would suggest under the current delegations that would just simply be full council. And it's important to note that the policy does not apply retrospectively, so what's currently in place remains the case whilst those venues keep their licences. It's only if those licences lapse or new licences are sought that the conditions of the policy what's within your discretion to be able to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve, and we've got a section on that later. Any questions at the moment, or shall I dive into the social impact of gambling? In terms of the returns? Yeah. Yeah.
It means there's a house edge of 10% in 96. 5%. That the 90% spread over a small number. Those usually and most people benefit a little lower than pretty standard for New Zealand. But it doesn't mean that everyone that plays 90%.
No. Right, moving on. So, as part of undertaking any review of the policy, we're required to consider the social impact. Our previous review, 3 years ago, we commissioned some consultants to produce a report. What we propose in this review, and it will come through in the March paper for council, is simply to update that. So, this isn't a holus bolus new social impact assessment. It's an update of what we consider to be a very solid base. I've posed a series of questions here that, to me, are and sorry, not all of them are framed up as questions, and we will touch on this later once you've had some of that information about how gambling harm, gambling expenditure, and the social impact is tracking. Number of machines and venues in the district, and apologies for just my snips here. So this is comparing the 3-year period, what was the case in September 2022 when the policy was last reviewed, versus the latest available. Overall is that as a district there's been a decrease of 1 venue, being the Cosmopolitan Club, and a decrease of 10 machines, so nearly 8% of venues and 6% of electronic gaming. And it's broken down on the right there as to how those numbers are formed. The percentages, of course, look large, but of course it's off a relatively low base. But the key thing, I suppose, is that there's now fewer machines per resident, 18 plus, compared with 3 years ago. And you can see that as a good or a bad thing, or read into that what you will, but that is obviously the fact, and we'll allude on some of that shortly. Councillor Scott.
Brendan, I have a question. Just sorry, I know the Cosy Club obviously shut, so that's the -7, but the other reductions, is that due to our policy setting change? Oh no, okay, just.
No, I would not. And there. So because the policy can't apply retrospectively, as I understand it, prior to the 2020. Obviously had the discretion to increase their number of machines. If I look at my data, for example, if if I'm reading my spreadsheet correctly, they've gone back up to 10, so they would have existed prior to that 2001, I think it was, cut off. Yeah. So the next thing, and this is, I suppose, a large aspect of social impact, is the loss per head. So this is overall, and it doesn't, it's averaged, and it doesn't obviously speak to the disproportionate harm that may occur. But what this tries to do is take the expenditure on gambling, also known as GMP or gambling machine profit, per capita basis for the population that's 18 plus, seeing as you have to be 18 or older to play these machines. And if we look at that on a loss per head basis, in 2022, the district was, according to DIA figures, right at the top, or basically at the top, second from top, in Canterbury, and much higher than the Canterbury or the New Zealand average. The figures that I'm going to show you, by the way, they are nominal. I adjust for inflation shortly. It was based on the 2003 census, and just noting that the New Zealand value there is estimated. It's estimated there's about 4 million people in New Zealand 18 plus.
Sorry, Brendan. So is that, what does GMP stand for? Sorry, gaming machine. Not TAB, it's not online lotto, it's not anything else. It'd be really interesting to see that overall, wouldn't it? I'm not asking you to do that, but it would be interesting.
When I looked at these, I thought Mackenzie's got obviously quite a high number of individuals go through their district and would gamble as a pastime. And then I know that for us in Timaru, I often so I wonder what the influence of those factors are on these numbers. That's what I thought when I looked at it. Yeah.
Yeah. Paul's entirely correct. Different districts will have different factors there. For example, I thought Selwyn looked far lower than I might have thought might be the case, but it could possibly be that they mainly go to Christchurch to gamble, perhaps. Christchurch also has persistently high loss per head, as we'll see, and I've got a little bit of commentary later on, basically frustration from their council about how relatively ineffective these policies can be to affect their situation. They do, but that's excluded from these numbers. But then a wider cultural infrastructure built around that casino or other entertainment opportunities, shall we call it, that might facilitate a bigger spend on Class 4 gambling. Councillor Pice, your question. Breakdown of that a little bit later, but there's not nearly as much data, shall we say, as there is on Class 4 machines.
The only other thing I was going to say was that when the east side of Christchurch became red zone, they noticed that the gambling spend didn't drop, it was just displaced. So there is sort of topic in that you note the correlation between the number of machines and the gambling spend is more tenuous than it sounds, I think, because who enjoy gambling tend to go elsewhere if they can't do it locally. So and now I would imagine the effectiveness of these policies with online gambling being available is different again. So it's a complicated topic, and it's not always what it.
So anyway, just to clarify, this is where we were in 2022. If we fast forward, and remember the numbers are nominal, where are we now? So if we look at GMP year end September 2025, again we're right at the bad end, shall we say. But the key thing to note is that on an is declining faster than the Canterbury or the New Zealand averages. So if you took spending in 2022 and changed nothing except inflation, if all the habits remain the same and the like, then you would have expected the Timaru district to have a higher GMP loss per head of $26.15 higher than what there is right there at the moment. You can see also that as well. You can see that some councils, some districts, are increasing on an inflation-adjusted basis prior to where they were before. And to me, that's interesting, and it simply is probably, I think, market forces more than anything else. And I certainly don't, because it's not as if we're getting applications for venues or machines and we're having to decline them, say, on the basis of, you want 8 machines, we only allow 7 and the like. But we'll talk about that slightly more.
Brendan, just in that though, you've used, and you've pointed this out, and I know why, but you've used the same population figure. And so if you calculated that loss,
You are quite right, the numbers are fraught. It certainly hasn't been designed to be selective in any way. It's just trying to use consistent numbers based on what's available. But I take your point. Just to give you a slight breakdown as well, just of the most recent quarter available. Again, that's showing that we're right at the top end there in terms of loss per head, but again, probably declining. The question then becomes, as we'll discuss later, what can council do about that if you perceive that that's a problem? Just to illustrate that slightly more, if you look at both the nominal and the inflation-adjusted spend across all of New Zealand from September 2022 to 25, and you compare that on an inflation-adjusted basis, that's down by just over 2%, but in our district it's down just over 9%. Now the question perhaps also becomes, what does that do for the amount that's being returned to the community if we think of that legislative requirement that 40% of the proceeds are returned in the form of grants and the like? And on a New Zealand basis, of course, that remains the case. You can see there that some years it's slightly more than 40%. But there's no guarantee that districts. So again, if you think of that money in, money out scenario, both from within communities but also at a national level, there is some sort of, I suppose, redistributive effect where money proportionally over those years selected, which are the years where data seems to be available, if I recall correctly, from that government website, that's flowing out of the district on. I think that the return to the community is not necessarily based on that gambling expenditure, the GMP. My suspicion would be that it would primarily depend on what are the particular projects that are seeking funding in any particular year, and who is seeking that funding. Are they good at applying for it, and questions like that? Because you can see that we've had, anywhere from 37% effectively in 2023, and basically half that in. I'd suggest that 2024 data is an outlier, but it is illustrative to show how these numbers do move around.
Brendan, but those numbers, so they wouldn't equate for the taxes, the venue, so that I find that quite disproportionate. the venue provider and all of that kind of stuff. So it looks, to me, you probably look there and you think, God, 2 million out of 11, that's not very good, but a heck of a lot of that goes to the government. So I think it's really important that, you know, I'm obviously an investment to our community. It props up our community significantly when it comes to not just sport, but arts, culture, everything, you know, who these providers are. So, you know, 1 million versus the return on 2, because that is incorrect. So I don't know, we would make an informed decision if we were making it today, if you looked at that. Well, what I'm saying is you could sit here and go, oh my goodness, this is terrible. Look how much money is going through the community versus the return, but that's incorrect. So if you've got another slide that's going to say, actually...
Slide simply is to is returned to the community in the form of grants, and then to say, what is the reality for the Timaru District? Are Timaru District organisations getting their quote-unquote fair share of the grant money? And this is simply showing that over the past 6 years that are considered in that, based on the data available, that the organisations in the district are getting less than the national average in terms of return. Fully appreciating your point that of that remaining amount, so look at 2024, 11 versus 2 million, you know, that 9 million, a lot of it goes to the government, a lot of it goes to venues, etc. But there will be a proportion, and in this case, seeing as we are 40, just over 43% in 2024 being returned as a national average, and there's the 11%, the 18% there, so that's odd percent that in that particular year has gone to other districts. Yeah. So that's all that slide's shown, to show that there isn't necessarily a strong relationship between expenditure on a national basis. Now, there's that government website that I've alluded to there, granted.govt.nz, that breaks down in very granular detail where the funding goes, and this slide is just simply an attempt to break that down at a high level for you, to show that it is indeed sports and community and health, welfare, rescue services that receive a disproportionate note that money that's given to a Timaru organisation from a national or regional body, and that's estimated to be around about 6% of the overall national spend. Yeah. Okay. Getting towards the end of the slides and more towards discussion. So areas of social deprivation. So if we refer to the handouts that are provided, so there will be more detail about this in the April sort of to help you locate where these venues are. Again, Class 4 venues, not TAB, we'll talk about that shortly, and the sorts of areas that they're located in. Now, the only change since the review 3 years ago has been that the Timaru South Cosmopolitan Club has been removed, but you can see that these venues are disproportionately located within areas of relatively high social deprivation, and you would then lead yourself to wonder, why is that the case? Why would they, for market reasons, deem that it's appropriate to set up there? If we think of who's affected by Class 4 gambling, as we said earlier, it's important to note that 500,000 people per year, roughly, according to Ministry of Health data, play pokies and TAB, and the vast majority of those, I think it's quite fair to say, are obviously not problem gamblers, and yet there is strong evidence that areas that have higher rates of deprivation are more likely to experience that gambling harm, and that risk is increased when the venues are located close to their houses, their communities, and that's a relatively established public health tenant, I suppose. So then, again, a question then becomes how to balance that, and we can talk about that shortly. Now, in terms of the extent to which people are affected by this, it's hard to tell definitively. We know that people that are affected by problem gambling, for example, or may have consequences that relate to social, financial, mental health facets of their life. Obviously, being under financial stress, it might be that they're more isolated. Their families. It can also, there's research to show that it has impact on their employment participation and crime. So it is more than just the statistics that which is around self-reported problem gambling or access to problem gambling services. But I will also note that in the 2022, make a copy of that, that Timaru district does probably have a lower risk profile than the national average when it comes to problem gambling, and that's because of our demographic makeup. We have less national average, I believe, and there is research to show that that those communities are disproportionately impacted by problem gambling. Slides perhaps, but this simply shows Canterbury over the last few years. Latest data available to June 2023, unfortunately, and in terms of where they're situated in terms of their problem gambling. Reported disclosures to the services that I mentioned before are funded by the levy. So take this with a grain of salt, and you can read various things into it. So for example, represented 0.29% of all participants. Where is less frequent within the district, or perhaps our residents are less likely to self-report. Perhaps there's wider reasons in play. Just thinking about wider trends, and again, I'm conscious of time. I think we've got around 15 minutes. So to your question before, Councillor Pai, on a inflation-adjusted expenditure per capita basis, which we can get, I believe, it shows that spending on pokie machines, that red line, is the largest of those four types of activity, but you can also see that it's been decreasing over time. You can see Lotto there, the yellow line coming second. I say casinos going up and down, and TAB perhaps holding steady, perhaps with a smidge of a decline. Now, what's not shown on there is online gambling, and that's because it's currently there is a suite of work that the DIA are currently undertaking to regulate online gambling. I believe the proposal is that there would be roughly 15 permitted online gambling sites and the like, and activity would have to online gambling activity would have to be taken through there. But that's all a proposal, and there's no definitive. Is out of scope for this policy. We don't have any ability to control it through the policy, But I'd suggest that you want to be cognizant of it because, as Paul alluded to before, there is that displacement effect, and we'll discuss that perhaps in a couple of slides' time. In terms of the wider TAB, again to your point before, Councillor Pye, Class 4 venues, their data is readily accessible. It's broken down by the DIA. It's harder to get accurate information about the TAB. Bear with me. This is by an informed source within council and cross-referencing it with a couple of other things. We've currently got one TAB venue within the district, and then that are located in other places, but the policy doesn't actually govern terminals, it governs venues. So we're thinking of that one venue. Also, whilst I don't have the in those numbers of physical venues and terminals, and a greater push to online TAB gambling through the app. Not sure if there was a question there, sorry.
I guess what I was getting at was some of that data in some of the communities that have very low spend per population. It would be interesting to see what their online spend is. There's lots of data. And the full effect and is reducing our machines. I'm not suggesting we do that, but will it, to Mr. Cooper's point, just displace that to online gambling, not actually solving the problem in machines?
Absolutely, and I'd love to be able to provide you with that data. Unfortunately, it's not available. For example, Lotto, to my knowledge, doesn't break down expenditure per district. Neither does a TAB. Casinos obviously less relevant. So to raise a point that I'll raise in a couple of slides' time, this is for me a very frustrating policy area because we are trying to address a particular issue with imperfect information and at least one hand tied behind our back, but we'll get to that. My best attempt at a summary of this data is simply to say that gambling loss per head at a faster rate than the Canterbury or the national average. That is possibly something to be celebrated when we consider the disproportionate source of that funding and that loss per head. But I don't think it's due because we haven't had, like I said before, been more machines or venues. Rather, I'd suspect it's due to that a wider national trend over a long period of time and more recent economic conditions probably. Maybe it's pertinent for council to consider that as and when economic conditions improve, will there possibly be any sort of increase relative to the status quo? Perhaps that longer, wider national trend will decrease, but perhaps there might be an increase and we're in perhaps an artificial dip. Loss per head data. Probably, but it's clear. Interested to see what the 2025 data says on that. Are there any questions? Oh, sorry, I'll just mention this and then I will pause for questions. To build indicators into all of our policies to help us track its performance over time, to help us identify trends and to help inform future reviews. And here are 5 that we think might be open for thoughts. The last 10 minutes, 8 minutes or so, up to Deputy Mayor as to how much time you're prepared to give us, but roughly 8 to 10 minutes. We intend but I'll just pause to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Brendan. We have got a good 10, 15, 20 minutes, haven't we? Going back to your previous slide there, yes, when I'm looking at these, that one, yeah, I'm really interested, obviously, on accurate evidence or data. I mean, for example, when we go down to number of gambling machines in areas of higher deprivation, I don't actually think that you can show that in South Canterbury. I don't think any of these, the three that are in town, are in the middle of town. One of them is at the Town and Country Club, one of them is at the Richards Pierce that has been there like since forever, and you look at Temuka, again, all three are in town, in old, good old-fashioned public drinking houses. So if you've got, say, 5 different points there, it's too easy to rate that as perhaps 20% of your consideration, where it's probably barely at all. But there's a whole lot of data that we could have around, what you say there, funds returned to the and also quite interested in that other information that said a massive amount left the district over the last 40 years. So where did that go, and what sort of organisations are getting that? Because those are all things that we need to consider, and in terms of what actually is problem gambling and how many problem gamblers do we actually have versus how many people gamble. That's the sort of information.
We can certainly look at that, and I think you won't be surprised for me to say some of that's obviously easier to obtain than others, and some of it we can rely on with a greater degree of confidence than others. You know, the problem gambling data, for instance, fraught with assumptions and qualifications and the like. On the point around number of gambling machines in areas of higher deprivation, I think you're quite right. In smaller communities, you know, there's fewer ways of obviously slicing and dicing those smaller communities than there are, say, in larger cities. Then yes, it is harder to draw meaningful conclusions from that deprivation data. But regardless, if it was to be done, then it would be a case of considering, you know, where's the threshold for high deprivation. As far as I'm aware, most councils seem to draw that at sort of 8+. And then, yeah, looking at tracking over time what's happening with the number of machines in those areas, noting that the deprivation index for particular not mesh blocks will change over time as well, or may do, and seeing, okay, what does that tell us? Because all data needs to be considered within a context. Just because data's saying one thing needs to be interpreted, obviously. So, yeah. Okay. All good. Okay, so in terms of policy levers, so this is a consideration of, you know, what levers can you pull, what dials can you turn, try and create whatever sort of outcomes you think are appropriate within this area. And there's mainly 4, although there's a 5th that we could add that's sort of potentially vogue, I suppose, that we can maybe talk through. And Paul and I can talk through sort of our, very briefly, again, mindful of time, our assessment of what the data's showing in terms of pulling what lever, you know, what sort of impact is that probably likely to have. So the legislation provides mainly 4 to set the number of machines, again this is class 4 gambling machines, per venue, and as I said earlier, for a new venue up to 9 are permitted by law, but in the current policy we've said we've got a maximum of 7. And in submissions, normally the trusts, etc., argue for the full 9, saying that there isn't data showing a correlation between number of machines and overall gambling harm, which we'll get to in a moment. Other councils have lower, so for example, Ashburton have 5. We can set a restriction on the number of machines or venues in a particular district. Now that can be a cap based on, for example, what's currently the case, or it could be lower than what's currently in place, and over time there would be a sinking lid down to that cap, or it could be higher than the current amount. For example, we have 12 venues in the district. You could say, this is just a complete example, but you could say, we're not going to have more than 15. Whether we ever achieve that obviously would depend on. But noting that a sinking lid is considered to be by public health to be the most effective tool in reducing. We are also able to make policy in relation to the location of machines and venues relative to sensitive sites. And the argument for that has mainly been that those sensitive sites are frequented by and there's possibly a need of protection there. Now, I recall in, I think it was the local alcohol policy discussions when we were reviewing that a couple of years ago, there being questions as, why should we put restrictions in place? When people, these so-called vulnerable people are members of the community, they'll be exposed to these in other places. And there is some tenuous or contested, shall I say, data as to how effective that is. But suffice to say, for now, that's a lever that's available. Relocation or mergers is also an option, so some councils don't allow venues to relocate or merge. Slight asterisk, there is some case law around this. That right now, unless you really want me to. We currently allow relocations at the discretion of the Environmental Services Committee. The fifth, slightly vogue, apply what they call an ethical standard, where they say we as council will not seek funding from any organisations, trusts or the like, that gain funds from these machines. That is probably more of a statement rather than something that necessarily impacts the overall social impact of gambling within those communities. What would the relationship be between problem gambling rates or loss per head, total expenditure, etc. Like for now, the research that's out there is contested on some of these points. There does seem to be general agreement that lower socioeconomic areas are the most heavily impacted, and that also, where venues are located has a disproportionate impact on the communities, particular area, the households that live in that area. Like that, disproportionately affected. But I would also suggest that there's evidence that these links and relationships are breaking down over time as more options are available to gamblers and people that want to gamble, whether that be purely for enjoyment and that be purely under control, or whether that legislation was set in 2003 when the context, the environment was radically different to what it is now, and there is I think quite a bit of agreement. I think we actually raised this 3 years ago in our previous review, that it is out of date and due for a wider overhaul. And to help illustrate that, I'll note Christchurch City Council, when they reviewed their policy, most recently, I think it was 2025, look, we have by their consideration. A relatively high loss per head. You saw that they're at the top of the Canterbury charts there, and much higher than the national average. They've had a sinking lid for a long to outcomes in this for their community. They're arguing no. They're saying to the government, we want more tools. So I appreciate that it's slightly weird and perverse for me as a policy. Here's a policy topic, and you've got options, but they are relatively ineffectual. But I would suggest that they are indeed relatively ineffectual. But I would suggest that they're certainly not going to provide any sort of drastic impact, depending on what sort of outcome you might be wanting to create. A couple of reasons for that. Like I said, you've got the wide range of options that are available to people, and a small number of those are within scope of this. As I say, it doesn't speak to online gambling. And then secondly, there's obviously the retrospective element to the policy. So let's just say, for complete argument's sake, council said, we don't like Class 4 gambling, we want to shut it down, the venues that currently have licences, there'd be a sinking lid over time. And Paul might want to speak to the mechanics of that slightly more. The final point that I'll just note there, that impact on community funding, and this is purely just because I forgot to raise it before, sorry. I think there's agreement that there isn't a strong relationship between the number of machines and venues and overall community. I think both proponents for policy would agree on that point for different reasons. Very finally, because I know I've gone over time, Your Deputy Worship, to bring a paper and some prepared material if you wish to go out for consultation. If you want to roll over the existing policy without any material changes, then consultation is not required by law unless you deem that you want to get the informed view of your community. If you seek change or want community views, then we'll go out for a consultation period. Depending on how that meeting goes on the 31st of March, 2 April to 10 May may be ambitious, who knows. But in May, anything more from the DIA since I last spoke to them several months ago before Christmas. They know that we're overdue on this, but they're not breathing down our necks or the like. I think they're keen for us to do it properly, and I think they appreciate the wider context of these policies, shall we say. Anything you want to add, Paul?
No, it's always an interesting debate every 3 years. And there's, the answers aren't as clear as people often assume. So, I mean, you could argue, for example, that having a controlled environment is better than an uncontrolled environment, and therefore a licensed or Class 4 venue is being controlled with a host who's monitoring activity there is better than being at home in your lounge, on your couch, gambling away online. So there's so many different factors to think about, but I think if numbers are declining naturally, and you could argue, I think it makes it simpler for council to find a view that if you want to encourage that by putting in a sinking lid, and we go at, if you want to roll over, I think that position is justified. So I think it's just dependent on what elected members want to do after having heard all the evidence, but that's the environment we've got.
And I'd also, over time we seem to be tracking down. Are we as a district at the moment in potentially an artificial dip relative to where we'd otherwise be? Will we possibly track back up? If we were, is that of concern two councillors. If you said yes to that, then you might be looking more at a sinking lid relative to, the current policy and allowing market forces to play out a little bit more. Is that it obviously takes impact, and it doesn't necessarily impact the expenditure or the loss per head in any sort of direct way, in the short term or medium term perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. If I remember correctly, this was one of the first things we did at the start of last term. So if you want to take your time and go back through the website and look up when we did do it, the submissions, I think you're going to see there were some pretty good submissions both sides, and I dare say the themes will be exactly the same. I think it's worth a poke through before the 31st of March.
And us what we changed, if anything, last time round, would be really useful, yeah.
My understanding is that it was a rollover with some very there's some media reporting about consideration of it going up to 9, but
Thanks for bringing that back to me.
and about the timing, you're right. This was one of the first, or in one of the first meetings, the adoption of the current policy for the last triennium. And this time last year, when we started to think about this review, we deliberately wanted to avoid that because we felt that it wasn't intended back in 2022, but it became unfair, perhaps, that one council considered the initial policy, had adopted it for consultation, etc. There were elections, and then it was a new council that was asked to make a decision on that. So our initial plan had been to do the prep work and bring it to you in sort of December or the like, but several things came up to stop that, and then also we hadn't fully appreciated the legislative requirements to complete the review within the 3 years, rather than just simply commence the review within 3 years.
Fair enough. Thank you, gentlemen. I think, team, that's the end of that workshop. Do we have Roo coming in? Is that still happening? Lovely. We've got 5 minutes. Thanks very much, gents.